you doing?
Good. How you doing?
Not too bad. How are you doing today? Oh, good. That's great. Peace of Christ. Peace of Christ. How do you experience passing the peace? Is it as a social gesture or is it as a sacred act? Just think about that for a moment. That's exactly the question that I set out to explore. But before we investigate this question, what do we know about passing the peace? Passing the peace began as the kiss of peace, which is one of the oldest practices of the Christian tradition. Its origins began in early Christian communion liturgy, where it indicated, "This is a sign of peace. Let peace be made in your conscience." By the High Middle Ages, it was still a time of reconciliation and Christian unity during communion, but it was also found in other Christian rituals, such as baptism, ordination, and the consecration of bishops, to name a few. In addition, it was not only exchanged during religious ceremonies and rites, but was also in the legal realm as well. The kiss of peace could be exchanged in rituals of contract making, dispute settlement, or in the act of homage. During this time, and in particular within medieval law, the kiss supplanted older customary forms such as a handshake, insertion of hands, or the transfer of a rod. It was a legal gesture in order for that contract to be binding. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the peace was understood as a fundamental connection between inside and outside, soul and body. The kiss of peace could express the movements of the soul and spirit. The performance of specific gestures could move the soul to certain knowledge or affection. Across the history of medieval gesture, this sense of exchange and mutual influence was never absent. Therefore, the kiss of peace was not considered an ordinary or everyday gesture, but something that was special and could reflect or effect more profound and abstract values. According to Bernard of Clairvaux, the kiss of peace could express the abstract, the ineffable, connecting mystical experience, theological understanding, and liturgical symbolism. In the religious realm, the kiss united the mutual love of Christ and the faithful soul. It was during this time within Christian liturgy that the pax board was introduced. The priest would kiss the pax board, and then the deacon or the subdeacon would kiss it, and then they would pass it on from one to another with devotion. The pax board was hierarchical in nature as it transmitted the love of Christ as the Lord gives, love to the church to the priests, and the priest to those standing by. In addition to the introduction of the pax board, the kiss was beginning to become a substitute for communion, rather than as a preparation or receiving of communion. This evolution demonstrated the level of importance the kiss of peace was having within the church, as it was seen as having the power to link the visible, what is shown, with the spiritual. This power to connect the inside to the outside, also making this gesture very versatile, but it also made it deeply ambiguous. Within various German Protestant liturgies from the 1520s, there was only one incident of the liturgical kiss that is described. As a practice, the pastor kissed the gospel book just before communion was distributed. Any sort of physical kiss of peace was eliminated. In most Protestant worship service, there was an inclusion of a prayer of peace and a response from the congregation. But the body and the kiss could no longer symbolize or evoke this peace. The kiss was no longer a kiss, but now a prayer. It was no longer something intimate and shared among Christians, but now was brought forth by one individually verbally. For this Christian practice, the intimate connection to community, its role of reconciliation, and unity was being lost. For the kiss of peace, there was little interest in restoring or reforming the kiss of peace. According to Martin Luther, the kiss was no longer a transcendent sign of peace. The fundamentals of the kiss of peace from early Christianity and medieval times, which held the publicly belief that this gesture should connect body and spirit in mutual influence. It no longer existed. Within worship, due to the separation of inside and outside, it made it much more difficult for the kiss to connect to social values like peace, Christian unity, or political order with the individual. Its versatile range of meanings was lost. Opportunities for the kiss of peace to aid in reconciliation were no longer available. Within Roman and non-Roman churches, the physical act of the kiss of peace was missing from worship for hundreds of years. And apparently, it was never greatly missed. Move forward to the not too distant past, 1950, where the grand debut of the kiss of peace emerged, now known as passing the peace, a handshake. It happens in the liturgy in the United Church of South India. Its reemergence was partly due to the growing emphasis upon the church as the body of Christ. But it was not fast and furious. In 1969, in the United Church of Canada, it was introduced in their worship liturgy. However, at this time, there was more emphasis placed on the practicum of passing the peace, how it was structured within liturgy, rather than the theological understanding. So it's been 43 years since its debut in the United Church of Canada, and I wonder, how do individuals experience the liturgical practice of passing the peace in Sunday worship? There are several factors that led me to this question, to this point where I'm standing before you now. The first was my own personal transformation story. In 2008, in this very chapel, and I think it was back there by Rob Fennell, I passed the peace for the very first time. And I'll let you know, it was nothing earth-shattering. And I wasn't quite sure why I was shaking hands with practical strangers during worship. Later that same week, I attended a lecture given by Dr. David Dean, professor of systematic and historical theology here at the Atlantic School of Theology. And he passionately spoke about transformation with a focus on passing the peace, its true meaning or intent, and its perceptions in today's Christian church. He highlighted how passing the peace had moved from a sacramental act, as in early Christianity, where it embodied the act of reconciliation with one another. This meant that if you were hungry, I would feed you. If you were thirsty, I would give you something to drink. I passed you peace. Now to a time of social greetings. Hold on. Whoa. You mean this handshake means much more than that? I am actually passing peace to somebody else. This was transforming and life-altering for me. I no longer saw it as a social greeting, hey, how you doing? But something very more profound. With my whole worldview shaken to its core, a burning desire to know more about the passing of peace, and my passion for this liturgical practice took on a life of its own. As my classmates will say, I got lit. Then I became curious. Why didn't I know about this before? How do other people feel about this liturgical practice? I became an investigator. How was I experiencing passing the peace in worship? Sometimes it was with sacred intent, while more often than times, it was not even practice, or it was a time to say hello to your neighbor. So I started to look to my own denomination for answers to my questions, only to discover that passing the peace is not a common liturgical practice within the United Church of Canada. And because it's not, there's a definite lack of resources. So hence, the rationale of my grad project. It was born. So I set out on my quest. I interviewed several participants from 2 United Church of Canada congregations. One congregation did not regularly pass the peace during Sunday worship, while the other did. And for the purposes of this project, all participants have been given aliases. So what did I learn? I can tell you the data was immense, and at times very overwhelming. But as I wheedled my way through, there were 3 significant themes that emerged from the voices I interviewed. The first theme was connection, which manifested itself as physical and spiritual. The next theme was transformation, and the last was sacredness. In today's society, being connected has links to technology more so than relationships. However, in early Christianity, the kiss was a way of connecting because it was a bond that was unbreakable. The covenant of unity was not only communication of the peace of God, but it was also an intricate factor for early Christians and the doctrine of the Trinity because it signified unification of the Christian community. Those I interviewed experienced passing the peace as a connector, as a time of binding. Psychiatrist Ernest Wolfe wrote in his book, Treating the Self, about the merger need as one of the primary needs essential to human existence. The ability to connect for my participants gave them an opportunity to relate with other people, the worship service, community, and God. And this connection manifested itself in 2 ways, physically and spiritually. One common factor for physical connection was touch. We see the significance of touch in the Bible. The woman reached out to touch the hem of Jesus' cloak. Jesus healed many with his touch. Now we live in a time when touch can be seen in such a negative light. Yet it was identified by my participants as one of 3 main elements necessary for passing the peace. Harold said, "It's very important. And if I did it, passing the peace, without shaking your hand and saying the peace of Christ, it doesn't do it for me the way a physical connection will do it." While Mary Ann said, "I feel really good about the fact that I can share with someone just a little touch, a little feeling, and I feel that that person knows that I'm thinking of them. So when I pass the peace, I am thinking of you." Most participants shared their experience during flu season and the H1N1 health scare and its impact on passing the peace. When I asked how it made them feel to pass the peace without physically touching, Felix said, "It didn't seem significant somehow, even though I was convinced that in my mind, I'm saying that little prayer. The fact that you couldn't touch the person," and he demonstrated and he showed me, he said, "touch the person," made a difference. The touch is a part of it for sure. It is for me. The touch is important. For Beverly, she said, "That's different. That's different. It's not the same as touching another person and passing the peace with touch." While another, Mary Ann, she was adamant. They tried passing the peace with no touching. And you can't do it. I can't. This is what you do. Peace of Christ. But you can do that very quickly. But in order to touch someone and take their hand, it takes more effort And you have to have that connection. I find that's quite different than when you do the nod. The second main physical element was eye contact. A lingering look, a glance held for moments rather than seconds, or an intentional gaze between friends or strangers, that was a significant part of their experience as well. Felix said, I make a conscious effort to have it mean a little bit more to me, so I try to look the person in the eye. I try to make a little bit more of contact than simply, hello, how are you? While Dennis indicated that to genuinely look into someone else's face and their eyes and perhaps acknowledge that individual so it may be a more sincere greeting. However, not all felt that way. When discussion was held on flu season and the H1N1 health scare with regards to no touching, Beverly shared this. Eye contact is better, but it doesn't matter. To look at someone is almost a touch, but not quite a touch. For her, touch was the most important aspect. However, eye contact was better than the alternative. Nothing at all. The last main physical element, which aided participants feeling connected during passing the peace, was spoken words. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Just as this was a significant moment with Jesus and his disciples, participants 2,000 years later recognized their impact as well. Harold said, saying to someone, "Peace be with you," that's a hugely powerful statement. While Weldon felt, I couldn't have said those words without meaning it. If you just said them in another way where you didn't mean it, it would just be bad. Not only was giving the words important, but receiving them as well. For Beverly, her experience is, the Christ within you is talking to the Christ in the person. I feel it is important, and I like to have the response said. The second component of connection was spiritual. Participants experienced passing the peace as a bond, as a way of drawing closer to their church, community, and God. According to Stanley Hauerwas, Christian theologian, church as God's creation is a community whose memory of its Savior creates the miracle of being a people whose very differences contribute to their unity. Marianne says, it extends your bond in the church. The best thing is that bond you feel with the other person. You already have that connection with the spiritual. You have a special feeling. You're thinking about your relationship with God. The passing of the peace is when you share that you have this common bond with the other person. Harold indicated, we're not only involving you and I, but we're involving a spiritual connection. We're saying to each other on a spiritual level, we want to engage Christ. And I think that's a profound statement, you know. It's a statement of peace, of Christ, of spirituality, and the godliness. While Weldon's experience is, you make this connection with this person. You look them in the eye, and you say those words. Yeah, he said, that's getting closer to God. And even though Beverly had difficulty naming it, she saw it as, you have this opportunity, like intentionally putting out your hand, and you feel this thing that's there, but you have forgotten to feel it all week. She still recognized that something was happening. The second theme that emerged from my participants' data was transformation. Soteriology, or the doctrine of salvation, as understood in the early church, was, according to Dr. David Dean in his essay on Passing the Peace, a process of deification, the rupturing of space between God and us by the power of God, the Holy Spirit. He stated that as being Christ-like is what we are intended to be the self, we must be transformed in order to conform to Christ. This transformation from being things like me to things like Christ is the basic form of salvation as understood in the early church. And so for most of my participants, transformation was relational to their understanding of passing of the peace. Initially for them, they experienced passing the peace as uncomfortable, something of a novelty, and unfamiliar. However, their experience changed. Felix was eager to talk about his transformation. I'll say that my understanding of passing the peace has changed since I first started doing it. At first, it was simply a greeting, turn around, say hello, shake your hand or whatever. But it's begun to mean much more to me. It's gone beyond simply a good morning or how are you. It's taken on more of a spiritual meaning as opposed to simply greeting someone as you greet anybody. While Weldon recognized that this is a more meaningful thing than having the greeter shake your hand when you come through the door to get your bulletin. This is heavier than that. It is meant to be. Harold reflected on his inner transformation. It helps me become more reflective on what it really means to say those words. For me to say to you, peace be with you, it's peace in every sense of the word. What it does is it has a calming effect. It just helps me to be just more in tune. Beverly's experience acts as a reminder for her. I'm aware that Christ is within me, has been, and you're passing it. You're giving peace to someone else. Dennis's understanding was that it's an opportunity to recognize the Christ in each one of us. However, he also indicated that he never saw Christ in the other when he passed the peace. He felt that passing the peace, as he stated, as an opportunity for the congregation to meet and greet and to reaffirm friendship in the community with other people. But our church regularly has a coffee time where he sees that as an opportunity to do that. And he says, I don't see it, passing the peace, as being critical. The last theme that emerged was sacredness. Since its reemergence, placement of passing the peace has been cumbersome. Its roots are found in the sacrament of Holy Communion as a sign of reconciliation with God and our brothers and sisters in Christ. So it was understood as a sacred act. During United Church worship, participants felt that passing the peace went very, very quickly from a sacred act to social conversation. For most, this was seen as disruptive and eroded the spiritual sacredness of this liturgical practice. Even though the original understanding of being a sacred act may be missing, it wasn't lost on my participants. For Dennis, he could potentially see the intent of passing the peace as a sacred act, but it depended on how it was framed. In terms of the sacrament of Holy Communion, these are elements which humans have brought to a table to give other humans, and unless you frame it around something which tries to give you some sacredness to it, I mean, what is it more than just a little bit of juice and a little bit of bread? So one could say, okay, this is a handshake. Unless we can frame it around why it is intended to be significant, what's there about this that makes this passing of the peace by the people within this congregation, what makes it so special? Otherwise, people may not see it in themselves why it is special. For others, they already saw it as framed as a sacred act. Weldon said, "For me, spiritually, I think anything that binds us more deeply, things like how we take communion, it's part of that sacred peace within our church service. So I think it is a sacred act." While Felix shared, when we're passing the communion elements, we always try to say something like body of Christ or blood of Christ. There's a little more spirituality in passing the elements or in passing the peace. When I asked Beverly why she felt passing the peace was important, she said, because it's Christ. You could say in sacred terms, the Christ within me greets the Christ with you. And at that moment, you're mentioning Christ as if he's almost there. It's the same as when you have communion. It's the blood. So how can this help the church? What are the implications? One significant implication was the need and desire for education. When I asked individuals what their understanding of passing the peace was, initially some immediately migrated to the physical act of passing the peace. Its weekly placement in worship, liturgical seasons, how they pass it, what they do. While two individuals stated, I really don't have a solid understanding of it. If there's like any roots of it or the origins. While another said, I guess I need to have a better understanding. I don't know a good understanding of what is the intent. Even though an understanding emerged from their interviews, they were not able to name it directly. In 1988, Alan Barthel's book, A Guide to Sunday Worship in the United Church of Canada, he identified the importance of teaching churches and congregants the true meaning and intent of passing the peace, and how that could be accomplished through education. Yet 23 years later, this seems to be an area that is still lacking. In conjunction with education, there's a lack of denominational resources. This became evident. In order for clergy and laity to have a greater understanding of passing the peace, resources need to be made available to assist in their ability to provide this education. And lastly, there's a strong desire for passing the peace to be framed with sacredness. By framing this liturgical practice as a sacred act, such as Holy Communion, it may increase individual awareness of its significance and could potentially help alleviate the emergence of social time that can occur during passing the peace. One participant felt that the social conversation was an extension of the passing of the peace. However, a general consensus from participants was that it should remain sacred rather than social. In Barthel's book, A Guide to Sunday Worship in the United Church of Canada, he states that when practicing passing the peace, it's important for the presider's invitation to the peace to bring out its significance for worship as unity in Christ, in order that it not simply become an invitation to say hello to your neighbor. For the United Church of Canada, passing the peace was meant to be understood not as a social gesture, but a sacred act. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Great job, Kim.
Thank you.
I know you've been working on this for years, but
Yes.
You mentioned your transformation story, and you mentioned the transformation that some of your participants had in the past. I was just wondering, I didn't hear it, and maybe I wasn't listening closely enough, but were there any transformations mentioned because of the work you were doing?
Well, it's interesting you should talk about that, because everybody in my class knows I've been since September, I've been a ball of fire for my grad project. And every week or whenever we would come in and do check-in, my hand was like, ee! So I was so excited. And because my transformation was so transformative, I didn't want to taint anybody else. I didn't want to taint the data. So I had to control myself very, very well during the interviews. I really did. Jody would be proud. But at the last minute, I'd say four out of the 6 interviews, they asked me about how I came to this project. And all my interviews, I'd say, is this interview over now? And they would say, yeah. So we'd close off the interview, and I'd shut off my iPhone, and I'd tell them my story. I'd tell them the story that I told here today. And I would tell them how I learned and how I went from it. And then I'd get, whoa, the big, okay. So this is what it means. The educational component, would you come back? I had 6 of them said, would you come to our church and do a presentation, a day workshop on passing the peace? And so I can't say, unless I go back and speak to them and say, oh, did I make an impact on you? Did my transformative story impact you? But I know that when I told the history, I give a mini tutorial after my interviews, I said to one person, I said, and I said this in class too, I think when you know the difference, when you know the intent, whether you do a handshake that's a social gesture or a sacred act, you cannot pass the peace without having that knowledge in your brain and in your being. And so, but it's your choice then how you approach passing the peace. And when I said that to that person, so I said, you may not believe it today, but you're transformed. And he looked at me and he said, really? I said, yeah, you are. And he said, how is that? I said, because when you go back now to pass the peace, I said, if it's in 4 months or next year, you're going to hear my words of its intent. You're going to hear this is going to be like a recording in the back of your head. So you're not going to be able to look at passing the peace the same. And he was like, you know what? You're exactly right. So that's the only impact I could say that I had. You are going to be transformed here today.
Whether you like it or not. Here you go.
Preach it, sister.
Oh, that's it.
Kim, you mentioned at the outset that you had subjects in a congregation where passing the peace was a regular part of the liturgy and subjects in a congregation where it wasn't. Mm-hmm. What differences did you note in the responses between those who were accustomed to passing the peace every Sunday and those for whom it happened occasionally or perhaps due to liturgical season or at communion?
I was expecting some differences. I was expecting... I was kind of thinking there would be a variant in the data that would bring that forward. But the 6 participants that I had, they were, it was pretty much everything was mainline. They just kept it. That didn't become evident. If you had put them all down and I didn't know the congregation was a congregation that passed the peace, or if it was a congregation that didn't, you wouldn't tell from the participants. Others had those who did not regularly pass the peace had a desire for it to become more frequent within their congregation. And those that were passing the peace, I had asked, does it become rote? It's coming every week. Is it something that you're kind of like, why are we doing this? And they said, no. When I asked them, they were like, I thought about that, and I was thinking, no, it's something that they look forward to. There's an excitement, there's a thrill, and one guy said. So I don't think there was no big difference. I couldn't tell within the data or within the individual's experiences.
So Ruby and then Helen. Ruby.
Thanks for that. I think it was great. I'm kind of scared to ask my question after your answer to the previous question. Often I will have people say to me that they don't like the passing of the peace. And I've actually had one woman say to me, in the Anglican Church, we have, of course, the two prayer books that we use mainly. The Book of Common Prayer, the passing of the peace is not a practice. And she'll seek out churches that use that book only so that she doesn't have to physically touch anybody. Did you run into that? And if you did, I'm wondering how you handle it.
Well, my first day out in one of the congregations, my first day out in the field, I got up and did my spiel, how I was here to do this project, and the congregation had willingly accepted me in, and I thanked them. And so I did like a little history, and then we went to pass the peace, and everything looked good, everything was going good, and this woman came up to me and she said, I have a social disorder. I can't touch anybody. And my heart sounds, she was like, I feel so uncomfortable. And she's pouring her heart out to me in the front of the church. And I specifically said to her, this is not meant to make you uncomfortable. Like, this is not the intent. So if you're not comfortable passing the peace, don't pass the peace. Like, if this is not for you, wholeheartedly don't participate. That's up to yourself. This is not meant for you to be uncomfortable with. And I had not experienced that because, here in the chapel, we all pass the peace. We make sure everybody's touched, everybody's included. If there's 50 people are going to be included, So I had not experienced that. And I had a lot of thinking about that. And I was expecting that to come up in my data. I was expecting that even when they were talking about H1N1 in the flu season, I kind of thought, they're going to say, well, it's okay. Some are very adamant, like, we can't touch, but it's not the same. And so touch was a big factor for them, and I was really, really surprised that they were as adamant as what they were about the aspect of touch.
And we're coming over to Helen. Helen.
Welcome. Well, first, in response to Ruby, I was just sort of thinking, I wonder if because of your recruitment process that you sort of organically kind of eked out the participants who did not, who were anti, passing of the peace, and perhaps that, you didn't have that voice. So I don't know if that speaks to the recruitment, so maybe there's another study with the resistors.
Yeah.
I also wanted to say, when I first came to AST, I had no clue what this meant, and it's largely because of you that I was transformed. As someone who does not identify as Christian, it's been quite a process, I guess, because to me, when asked to rise and share the peace of Christ, I've gone through like an evolution of first feeling not only resistant, but also theologically invaded, and then kind of trying to make a rationalization of how I could frame this for me and how it would work in a congregation where we are not sacramental, we're not doctrinal or non-dogmatic. So how would we find a place for a sharing of, I guess I would call it humanity and that spiritual essence that we all possess, no matter how we identify it. So I'm trying to figure out how I can do this, because it is meaningful, even if you are an atheist or a humanist or a pagan or a Buddhist, and there's a way there, I think, to share it.
I think you're exactly right. One of the questions that kind of I asked as I was doing my interviews, because they were basically it was framed around church. And I had done a paper in Theological Foundations with David Dean, and I had proposed a thesis that it could ripple out to the world, not necessarily keep it balled up to just the church, but it could ripple out, and it could affect every corner of this world. That's the way I see passing peace. That's my ideology, my idealism, basically. And so I was probing a couple of my participants, and I said, so do you see it going out beyond the four walls of the church? And two people in particular said, I pass the peace every day, and I don't even go through the doors of a church. I go to church on Sunday, but I pass peace every single day. It's to the stranger at the bus stop. It's to the person behind me in the grocery store. I pass peace. It's who comes through my office. So I don't think it's like we've got the corner on passing the peace. You know, the Christians got it, and that's it. We're keeping it. You know what I mean? I don't think we're going to patent it. I don't think we're going to patent it, and, you know, that's it. It's only for us. But I think, and that's the way I feel. And I was talking to Helen Chandler just before my presentation, and I was saying, I passed the peace, like how transformative this was for me. Like when I would get in traffic at the Mac Pass at the bridge, holy Toledo, no patience. Like, where's this person going? How come he's honking his horn? Like, no patience. Like, seriously. And after that, you look at the world differently. I'm like, you know what, buddy? Go right ahead. You know what? If that's going to make your life easier, go right ahead. You know? That's passing the peace to me. If that gives that guy peace, go right ahead. Gives me peace. Right? It's the listening ear when you're at the doctor's office and this person comes up to you and starts telling their life story, like spilling it out. You don't even know who they are. And they're spilling it out, and it's you looking at them and saying, just a nod. That's passing the peace. So I don't think it's confined to church, and I'm going to steal David Dean's theology or whatever, but it's a mode of being. It's who you are. It's a mode of being of who you can be in your everyday life. And that's transformative. Oh, lots of questions?
We can have a million questions. We've got 3 or 4 hands up. We're actually at time, so can we indulge you for a second?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
No tough ones, no tough ones.
Kim, thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
I want to say I was there at the beginning, in that room in 2008.
You were?
While you were being transformed. And I remember that presentation quite well. And I came away certainly grabbed by it as well. Also kind of horrified.
Yes.
I kind of felt I had to go home and clean up because half of you would probably be moving in with me by the end of the day, something like that, right? And so today my mind is going to the questions of the intersection of spirituality and materiality that comes up in your presentation as well. And, you know, that so-called epistle of straw, James, who says, you know, what is it? If I say to you, go, be well, stay warm, be well fed, what good does that do? And so thinking about the implications, you know, and how do we in the educational process explore that really actually disturbing aspect of the peace of Christ? And do we know what we mean when we say the peace of Christ be with you and what we're extending? And how do we cultivate a desire for that, in fact? And maybe that's enough to start with. Well,
it's funny because I'm doing your Jeremiah course. Not throwing a plug out there for you, Susan, or anything, but the Jeremiah course has been quite prophetic. And and you gave us a reading this week. You gave us a reading, and it was from Walter Brueggemann. And it talks exactly about that. Peace be peace, and there is no peace. And it talks about, basically it's from the American perspective. But it's very much the Canadian perspective. And it talks about how can we bring peace in a world where peace is not wanted, where peace is not engaged. And I think, you know, it's situations like this. It's situations where I know after David Dean's lecture that time, and he was horrifying, because I tell you, when he said, when you go to pass the peace, he said, I remember him saying, you'll either want to do it or you won't want to do it, because it's very binding. Like it's so profound. And when I got back in chapel, that happened on a Wednesday. When I got back in chapel on Thursday, I wanted to pass the peace, but I was half afraid, you know? And it's situations like this. And I think also, I remember getting on the phone and talking to family and friends and telling them, do you know what this means? It's word of mouth. It's when engaging. And I had people come up to me when I was doing this project, and they were adamant, like they just were adamant that they didn't want anything to do with passing the peace. And I'm thinking, and they're in church, and it's on a Sunday, and they're telling me, and I said, can I have you as an interview? Can I get you as an interview? And they were like, no, but I would have loved to have seen that perspective. And I came, because I came back to class after, and I was like, could have had him, but he didn't want to do it, you know? And I think it's education, but it's a desire. And I think it comes down to choice. It's a desire, and it's a choice in how you want that peace to be brought forth. So.
We had a phenomenal exploration of the passing of the peace, passionately delivered, obviously by Kim, but hearing and echoing the voices of her participants. Kim, you've taken us through a fascinating process. Kim, Burke-Cole, well done.